The 10 causes of death of the last popes. Pope Pius X, 1903 to 1914. Cause of death: myocardial infarction, heart attack. On the night of August 20th, 1914, Pope Pius X died at the age of 79 in the Apostolic Palace in Rome. The medical cause was an acute myocardial infarction, a sudden heart attack that occurred in his private chambers. Days earlier, severe bronchitis had undermined his robust health, leaving him debilitated. According to contemporary accounts, the pontiff was deeply distressed by the outbreak of World War I that same summer, which worsened his condition. Some even poetically said that he died of grief as he watched the world slide toward war. Pius X had enjoyed relatively good health during his papacy, but his final months were marked by this respiratory decline and anxiety over the world situation. He was 79 years old, an advanced age for the time, and had 11 years of a difficult pontificate behind him. The outbreak of the Great War, just 3 weeks before his death, caused him great concern. He spent long hours in prayer for world peace, which, coupled with his bronchial illness, sapped his strength day by day. The news of his death came amid the initial war tensions of 1914. The Catholic Church and the faithful received the news with sorrow, although the world's attention was focused on the impending war. Even so, Pius X was sincerely mourned by Catholics. His simplicity and personal holiness had left their mark. His funeral was held on August 23, 1914, at St. Peter's in a solemn but austere ceremony, as he had requested in his will. Decades later, in 1954, he would be canonized, confirming the veneration that many had for him since the moment of his death. Pope Benedict XV, 1914 to 1922. Cause of death: complications of bronchial pneumonia. Pope Benedict XV, successor to Pius X, died on January 22, 1922, at the age of 67, after just over 7 years of pontificate. The cause of his death was pleurisy, a severe inflammation of the pulmonary membranes caused by infection, which led to respiratory failure. It all began a few days earlier with what seemed like a common flu, but his condition quickly worsened into an aggressive bronchopneumonia that left him bedridden. Despite medical efforts, the disease progressed rapidly, causing severe respiratory distress. In the early hours of January 22nd, Benedict XV expired in his bed after hours of intermittent agony in which he sometimes seemed to recover, only to later critically relapse. The context of his death was marked by physical exhaustion following the years of World War I and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, events during which he had emerged as a tireless advocate for peace. Benedict XV was in relatively fragile health. Indeed, his intense humanitarian and diplomatic work during and after the Great War may have left him exhausted. In early 1922, he contracted a cold that, due to bacterial complications, progressed to pneumonia and pleurisy. In his final days, his condition worsened to the point that the international press followed every medical report with concern. He was only 67 years old, not so advanced for a pope, so his sudden decline took many by surprise. The immediate reaction to his death was one of profound mourning in the Catholic world and beyond. In Rome, thousands of faithful spontaneously gathered in St. Peter's Square, awaiting news during the papal agony. When his death was confirmed at 6 a.m., church bells rang out in mourning throughout the city. Leaders from many countries sent condolences, recognizing Benedict XV as the Pope of Peace for his wartime efforts. His body lay on display in the Sistine Chapel for 4 days, receiving visits from crowds of faithful who wished to bid farewell to the pontiff. The solemn funeral and burial in the Vatican crypt concluded a brief but intense pontificate, deeply mourned by the Church. Pope Pius XI, 1922 to 1939. Cause of death: myocardial infarction, heart attack. Pius XI died on February 10, 1939, at the age of 81, after 16 years at the head of the Church. Medically, he suffered a sudden myocardial infarction, heart attack, the culmination of a long heart condition that had been debilitating him. In the hours before, he had experienced severe chest pains. His health was already suffering from chronic conditions. In fact, he had long suffered from circulatory and heart problems that had worsened in his final years as papacy. In the early hours of February 10th, his heart finally gave out. He died in the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican, just a few months before the outbreak of World War II. The context of this death was particularly tense worldwide. Pius XI had been pope during the turbulent interwar period, facing the rise of totalitarianism. In 1938, he had raised his voice against Nazism and fascism and was planning further public condemnations. His health, however, was in marked decline. At 81, he was struggling with fatigue and frequent relapses of his illness. The fact that his death occurred on the eve of World War II, only a few months before its start in September 1939, led many to interpret his passing as the end of an era and the prelude to dark times. Some close associates mentioned that the Pope was deeply concerned about rising international tensions, which added stress to his already fragile physical condition. Pius XI's death caused deep sorrow in the Vatican and among the faithful, although it was surrounded by some concern about the current global situation. Immediately, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, Camerlengo at the time, assumed provisional duties and prepared the conclave that would elect the new pope in March 1939. In Rome, bells rang out his death, and memorial masses were celebrated. Given the imminence of war, his death may not have been met with the massive public displays of other occasions, but the Church respectfully bid farewell to a pontiff who had guided Catholicism through economic crises and the advances of fascism. His body was buried in the Vatican grottos, while the faithful prayed for him and for the peace so urgently needed in the world. Pope Pius XII, 1939 to 1958. Cause of death: myocardial infarction and complications of circulatory failure. Pope Pius XII died on October 9, 1958, at the age of 82, at the papal residence of Castel Gandolfo. The official version indicated that he died of acute heart failure caused by a myocardial infarction. Although his death was initially reported to have been sudden, in fact, Pius XII had suffered 2 strokes in the previous days that left him bedridden and semi-conscious. His health had been deteriorating for some time. He had suffered bouts of extreme fatigue and circulatory problems in recent years. In the early hours of October 9th, his heart stopped after this second stroke, ending his 19-year pontificate. It was 3:52 a.m. when his personal physician certified his death in the tranquil stillness of the papal summer residence. The context of his death was the twilight of a long pontificate, marked by World War II and the post-war period. Pius XII, born Eugenio Pacelli, had been at the head of the Church for almost 2 decades, and his figure dominated the middle of the 20th century. By 1958, he was already an elderly man in frail health. He suffered from hypertension and the weight of age. Days before his death, against usual advice, he had insisted on being left without constant assistance, which worried those close to him. When he suffered the first stroke, he was very weak, and the second stroke was fatal. His death occurred far from the hustle and bustle of Rome, in Castel Gandolfo, which gave his final moments an intimate, almost familial atmosphere. The news of Pius XII's death shocked the Church, and condolences soon poured in from around the world. Thousands of faithful came to pay their respects when his body was transferred to St. Peter's Basilica. However, the viewing phase of his remains was marred by a historic incident. Pius XII had left instructions not to embalm him, and his doctor experimented with an alternative method that proved disastrous. The body decomposed with unusual rapidity, bloating and emitting a penetrating odor during the public funeral. The coffin had to be hastily sealed and then the body reconstructed, even exploding gaseously from the internal pressure, in an episode that scandalized those present. This event, immediately after his death, led the Vatican to reform its mortuary protocols to avoid a similar situation happening again. Despite everything, the main impact of his passing was spiritual. Pius XII left behind a church in mourning, just as the 1958 conclave that would elect his successor was beginning. His controversial legacy and dramatic end deeply marked a generation that said goodbye to him. Pope John XXIII, 1958 to 1963. Cause of death: stomach cancer, gastric adenocarcinoma. Affectionately known as the Good Pope, John XXIII died on June 3, 1963, at the age of 81, after having led the Church for 5 years. The cause of death was stomach cancer, which plagued him for 8 months and ultimately proved incurable. Towards the end of 1962, he was diagnosed with this disease, which at that time was very difficult to treat at that age. Despite surgery and intensive care, the tumor spread rapidly in his body. In May 1963, the Vatican publicly reported the seriousness of his condition, preparing the faithful for the worst. In his final days, John XXIII suffered intense abdominal pain and extreme weakness. Finally, on the afternoon of June 3rd, he surrendered his soul after a serene agony surrounded by his close aides. The context of John XXIII's death was marked by the Second Vatican Council, which he himself had inaugurated in 1962. Despite his illness, the Pope maintained an optimistic and kind spirit until the very end. He was a leader beloved worldwide for his human warmth. As his health worsened, millions of people of different faiths joined in prayer for him, demonstrating the enormous affection he had earned. He was 81 years old, and although that was an advanced age, many hoped he would see the council concluded. This was not to be. He would leave that task in the hands of his successor. In his final moments, according to witnesses, he whispered the word "Mother" in memory of the Virgin Mary before expiring, which moved those who cared for him. The reaction after his death was one of profound mourning, but also gratitude for his example. In Rome, his funeral lasted several days and was marked by massive participation by the people. More than 50,000 people, mostly Romans, gathered in St. Peter's Square to pay tribute to the Pope of Goodness during his funeral. The funeral procession and the funeral masses were filled with tearful faithful who applauded the passing of the coffin in a show of affection. World leaders, from presidents to dignitaries of other religions, sent messages praising his work for peace. For John XXIII mediated the 1962 missile crisis and his renewal of the Church. His body was buried in St. Peter's Basilica and, decades later, declared a saint. The immediate impact of his passing was the continuity of the council. Paul VI, his successor, would soon announce that John XXIII's great work would continue, bringing comfort and purpose to the Church amidst its sadness. Pope Paul VI, 1963 to 1978. Cause of death: myocardial infarction, heart attack. Pope Paul VI died on August 6, 1978, at the age of 80, at his summer residence in Castel Gandolfo. The cause was a massive myocardial infarction, heart attack, resulting from his poor health and advanced age. That afternoon of August 6th, the feast of the Transfiguration of the Lord, a significant day for him, he suffered sudden, intense chest pain. Doctors rushed to him and managed to keep him alive for a few hours, but his heart finally gave out at 9:41 p.m. In his later years, Paul VI suffered various health problems, including chronic fatigue and breathing difficulties that occasionally required oxygen. All of this had sapped his strength. Even so, his death came as a surprise, as until shortly before, he had been carrying out his papal duties in Castel Gandolfo with moderation. After 15 years of pontificate, his body simply could not take any more. The context in which this death occurred was particularly historic for the Church. Paul VI had guided the end of the Second Vatican Council and the difficult implementation of its reforms during the turbulent 1960s and 1970s. His pontificate was fraught with challenges, internal tensions, social changes, doctrinal debates, which also took a physical and emotional toll. In July 1978, he had retired to Castel Gandolfo, his health failing, seeking some rest. The Pope was aware of his limitations and had arranged a simple funeral for when his time came. His death ushered in an unusual period. 1978 would be called the Year of the Three Popes, for within a span of weeks, the Church would lose Paul VI, elect John Paul I, and then face another unexpected papal death. It was a time of some uncertainty. The death of Paul VI marked the end of the conciliar era and left many questions about the future. The immediate reaction to Paul VI's death combined grief and solemnity. Being the height of summer, many faithful and tourists in Rome came to pray as soon as word of his worsening condition spread. After his death was announced, the Vatican bells tolled in his honor. His funeral, held on August 12, 1978, was carried out exactly as he had intended, with relative simplicity, without excessive pomp, but still followed by the entire world due to the importance of the figure being said goodbye. During the ceremony in St. Peter's Square, hundreds of thousands of people attended, moved. There were moving scenes, as 12 mourners carried his coffin to the tomb in the Vatican grottos, The tearful crowd gave warm applause, and the basilica bells rang out in unison. Many chanted "Long live the Pope" as a posthumous tribute, recalling his humility and service. This emotional farewell to Paul VI quickly gave way to the conclave of August 1978, in which the still emotional cardinals elected a successor who would continue Paul VI's legacy, the short-lived John Paul I. Pope John Paul I, 1978. Cause of death: acute myocardial infarction. John Paul I, the smiling Pope, had one of the shortest pontificates in modern history, only 33 days on the papal throne. His sudden death on the night of September 28, 1978, shocked the Catholic world. Albino Luciani was 65 years old and apparently in good health, so his death was completely unexpected. The official cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, while he was sleeping. The next morning, September 29th, his aides found him lifeless in bed, with the light on and some papers reading in his hands. Everything indicated that his death occurred painlessly during sleep, probably around 11 p.m. the previous night. No autopsy was performed, partly because of the medical certainty of a heart attack, and also due to Vatican regulations at the time, which later raised questions. The context amplified the impact of this death. John Paul I had been Pope for just over a month, during which time he had won the faithful sympathy for his warmth and humility. His friendly, smiling style had generated great hopes for renewal in the Church after the previous long pontificates. Precisely for this reason, his sudden departure left everyone stunned. In those 33 days, there were no public signs of ill health. Only later did it become known that he may have had chest pains in previous days, but nothing conclusive. His death occurred in the privacy of his chambers, with no one present, which would later fuel speculation. For the Church, still reeling from the death of Paul VI, facing another papal death so soon plunged the Vatican into a climate of urgency and disbelief. The immediate reaction combined shock and bewilderment. The faithful, initially incredulous at the news, soon expressed deep sorrow. They had enthusiastically welcomed John Paul I and were struggling to come to terms with his sudden loss. At the same time, conspiracy theories surrounding his death arose almost immediately, given the unusual nature of the situation. The lack of an autopsy and some confusing communications from the Vatican, such as who discovered the body, fueled rumors in the press and among the public. Speculation arose about poisoning or intrigue, although these were never proven, and the Holy See always maintained the version of a sudden heart attack. Regarding protocol, the impact was such that in just one day the College of Cardinals was forced to prepare a new conclave. John Paul I's brief reign left a taste of sadness and mystery. His funeral, on October 4, 1978, was attended by a massive influx of faithful wanting to bid farewell to the Pope who, however fleetingly, had won their hearts. The image of his serene face in death remained engraved in the memory of the Church, which mourned his passing as it prepared, once again, to elect a successor in that incredible year of 1978. Pope John Paul II, 1978 to 2005. Cause of death: severe heart failure and multiple organ failure. John Paul II, who was Pope for 27 years, died on April 2, 2005, at the age of 84, after a prolonged illness. The final cause of his death was multiple organ failure caused by complications of Parkinson's disease, aggravated by a generalized infection. In his final months, he suffered repeated infections, including a severe urinary tract and lung infection, which, combined with the weakness caused by Parkinson's disease, led to septic shock, a blood infection, and irreversible heart failure. By the afternoon of April 2nd, his blood pressure plummeted, and several organs failed simultaneously. The Pope had refused to return to the hospital in his final hours, remaining in his Vatican apartments. There, surrounded by some collaborators, and after receiving the last rites, he expired at 9:37 p.m. local time. His last audible words were reportedly, "Let me go to the Father's house," reflecting his awareness of his imminent passing. The context of John Paul II's death was followed, live around the world. Karol Wojtyła had been a very active and well-traveled pontiff, but in the final decade of his life, his health visibly declined. Since 2001, the progression of Parkinson's disease made it difficult for him to speak and move, yet he continued his duties until almost the end. In February and March 2005, he suffered hospitalizations for respiratory problems, including a tracheotomy, due to influenza and tracheitis, returning to the Vatican in a very fragile state. Millions of people around the world, Catholics and non-Catholics, followed the news of his death with concern. In St. Peter's Square, thousands of faithful gathered spontaneously to hold a candlelight vigil, praying rosaries and singing hymns while the Pope's health deteriorated in his apartment. It was the first time in the age of global communication that the agony of a pontiff was experienced virtually live on television and the internet. John Paul II, at 84, was closing a long chapter in the history of the Church that spanned from the Cold War to the new millennium. The death of John Paul II unleashed a wave of universal grief unprecedented in modern times. The official announcement provoked collective tears in the square. Many of those present, especially young people holding candles, burst into applause in gratitude for his life, while others chanted, "Sudden Saint," calling for his immediate sainthood, moved by his perceived sanctity. In the following days, more than 3 million pilgrims flocked to Rome to bid him farewell, forming lines that stretched for miles to see his coffin laid out on display. His funeral, on April 8, 2005, was one of the largest in history. More than 500,000 people filled St. Peter's Square and its surroundings, and delegations from 155 countries attended, including presidents, prime ministers, kings, and leaders of other religions. During the funeral mass, presided over by Cardinal Ratzinger, the wind turned the pages of the Gospels as they lay on the coffin, creating an image that will remain for posterity. At the end of the moving ceremony, John Paul II's body was laid to rest in the Vatican grottos, bringing to an end one of the most influential pontificates of the 20th century. The immediate consequence of his death was the convening of a conclave that, a few weeks later, would elect the first Polish pope in history as his successor. Curiously, he had already been himself. In this case, he would elect Benedict XVI, marking the beginning of a new era after the mourning period. Pope Benedict XVI, 2005 to 2013. Cause of death: multiple organ failure related to advanced age. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who had resigned the pontificate in 2013, died on December 31, 2022, at the age of 95. His death was caused by the worsening of age-related ailments. The specific cause reported was heart failure, the terminal weakening of his heart. In the weeks prior, his health had deteriorated markedly. Indeed, at the end of December, Pope Francis had asked for prayers for his ailing predecessor. Joseph Ratzinger had long suffered from general frailty, loss of muscle mass, and occasional respiratory problems, typical of his advanced age. Finally, on the morning of December 31st, his body peacefully lay in state at the Mater Ecclesiae Monastery in the Vatican, where he had been residing in retirement. At 9:34 a.m., his death was confirmed, thus closing the final page in the life of the first pope to resign in 6 centuries. The context of Benedict XVI's death was unique. Although he was no longer the reigning pope, his passing sparked great worldwide interest, as he was an emeritus pope. He had lived out of the spotlight for almost 10 years, devoted to prayer and reading in the Vatican monastery, while another pope, Francis, exercised the ministry. During that time, his health slowly declined, but without serious crises until the final days of 2022. At 95 years old, Benedict XVI was lucid but physically very weak. There was no prolonged public agony as with John Paul II. In this case, the news broke when he was already very close to death. His secretary and the few who assisted him were at his side in his final hours. His death, on New Year's Eve, took on a sober and contemplative tone, in keeping with his discreet personality. The immediate reaction was one of respect and serene remembrance. Given the exceptional circumstances of having a pope in office and another deceased, the Vatican organized a simple funeral, as Benedict had requested. Even so, tens of thousands of faithful attended St. Peter's Basilica during the funeral procession. It is estimated that around 195,000 people filed past his remains from January 2nd to 4, 2023. On January 5th, the funeral mass was celebrated in the square, presided over by Pope Francis, a historic event, with the reigning pope performing the obsequies of a pope emeritus. The ceremony, marked by sobriety, was attended by official delegations and faithful from around the world, although in smaller numbers than for his predecessor, given the different nature of his figure. In the end, Benedict XVI's coffin was buried in the Vatican crypt, in the same tomb occupied by John Paul II before his beatification. Immediately afterward, the Church fondly remembered his theological and intellectual legacy. While his death did not trigger a conclave, one had already been held in 2013 following his resignation, it did prompt a global reflection on the papacy emeritus and the example of humility that Ratzinger left the world. Pope Francis, 2013 to 2025. Cause of death: heart failure due to respiratory complications. Pope Francis died on April 21, 2025, at the age of 88, ending nearly 12 years of pontificate. The cause of his death was a massive cerebral stroke, cerebral hemorrhage, that caused an immediate coma, followed by irreversible cardiorespiratory collapse. At 7:35 a.m. on that Easter Monday, Jorge Mario Bergoglio expired at Casa Santa Marta, his Vatican residence. According to the official medical report, the stroke was large and sudden, and despite prompt care, he was unable to recover from the coma. His medical history included hypertension, and in February 2025, he had suffered from severe bilateral pneumonia that kept him hospitalized for 38 days. This respiratory illness left him noticeably weakened, and although he returned to his duties, his physical condition remained fragile. At Easter 2025, he presided over the rites with visible difficulty speaking, but with determination. Sadly, the following day, he suffered a fatal stroke. Doctors certified his death after performing an electrocardiogram, following the protocol for confirming the pontiff's death. The context of this death was that of an elderly but active pope until the end. Francis was the pontiff who broke several molds, the first Latin American and Jesuit to become pope, and a charismatic social reformer. In his later years, he had struggled with health issues, including colon surgery in 2021 and persistent knee pain that forced him to use a wheelchair at times. Nevertheless, he maintained a busy schedule. In early 2025, severe pneumonia raised concerns about his health, but he recovered enough to return to the Vatican. His death in the midst of Easter season took many by relative surprise. Although his ailments were known, few expected such a sudden end. He was 88 years old, and although his mind remained lucid and his spirit energetic, the accumulation of suffering proved to be too much. He passed away peacefully in his room after receiving immediate assistance that unfortunately failed to reverse the massive neurological damage. The immediate reaction to Pope Francis's death was global and overwhelming. A wave of grief and tributes erupted on every continent. Political and religious leaders of diverse ideologies expressed their condolences and highlighted Francis's human and spiritual legacy, praising his defense of the poor, his simplicity, and his work as a global moral guide. In St. Peter's Square, thousands of faithful and visitors lit candles and prayed as soon as the news spread, transforming the place into a moving gathering place. Soon, long lines of people began to form to pay tribute as his body was laid to rest. From the United States to the Philippines, cathedral bells rang out and masses were celebrated for the deceased pontiff. The international press devoted extensive coverage, recognizing Francis as a transformative figure for the Church in the 21st century. His funeral, held days later, drew dozens of heads of state, monarchs, and dignitaries, reflecting the immense influence he had beyond Catholic borders. In Rome, it was estimated that hundreds of thousands of people attended the funeral ceremonies over several days, bidding farewell with applause, tears, and the Vatican flag flying at half-staff. Immediately after the simple burial he had requested, without embalming and with an austere rite, in keeping with his wishes, the Vatican began preparations for the 2025 conclave. Thus concluded Francis's service on earth, leaving behind a church in mourning but united in hope, inspired by the example of a pope who lived with humility and dedication until the very end.
Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.